Welcome to another show, the Research to Reps Roundtable. I'm your co-host, Dr. Coach Pat Ivey. I am excited about this one, and I think it's about time we go ahead and get this thing kicked off. Dr. Ted Lambrinides. Ted, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Pat.
Oh,
Looking
that's
forward to
awesome.
today's podcast. It's a great way to start this weekend off.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. We're looking forward to that one. And to introduce our guest, we'll go ahead and kick it over to Dr. Reimer. What's going on, Ernie?
Hey, not much. Good to have everyone on. We have a special guest today, Dr. Paul Comfort. To go back in time a little bit, I'll share a little anecdote. Somewhere around the years, I'd say between like 2012 and 2014, my colleagues and I at my institution I was working with at the time, we were really interested in training for maximum power and understanding how to optimize the load, exercise selection, and all of these different things. And that's when I first stumbled across the work from Paul Comfort, and we were looking at the different Olympic lift variations. Actually have a PowerPoint slide from one of his studies up right in front of me now, and going all the way back then. That study was published in 2011, but it really had a big influence on the work that we were doing in those years, and it's really cool to be able to fast forward now to 2025, almost 2026, to have Paul Comfort on a podcast. Paul, how are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. Thanks for the invitation. It's also great to hear that people have actually read the research and used it as well. I know my students do because I tell them they have to. But it's always good to hear that it's made a little bit of an impact somewhere else.
It definitely has. And Mel, who's been on the podcast as well as Prue Cormier, and just really trying to valuable to us because we had lots of different groups of athletes who didn't have prior experience with the Olympic lifts, and so there's an issue, and when they catch the bar, hurting their wrists and not racking the bar properly, and so like, are we left like having to find new exercises? What your research and that of others kind of demonstrated was that the pull variations were actually had greater rates of force development and greater power than the traditional catch. So we started to implement that and adopt that with a lot of our sports and eliminated some of those. Um, I would love to hear a little bit more about let's that was a long time ago. How has that work evolved since then, and
That,
where
that
are we today with
side
some
of
of
the
your research?
research has evolved quite a lot since then. We've got to the point now. 2 years ago, we published the NSCA's position stand on the use of weightlifting for sports performance. So we'd originally started off just looking at well, how does exercise working from the knee, from mid-thigh, etc. Does it make a big difference? And actually, that stemmed from a student asking the question where the highest force, velocity, power, etc. So the student just sat there in a lecture and went, "Well, why do we bother with the rest of the lift?" And we're like, "I don't know, but it has those other components first. So maybe you hit the highest forces, velocities, powers, rate of force development at that point because you've already done the first pull, the transition, etc." So we decided we'd start looking at some of the research. And then as soon as we were finding that actually when we were eliminating the catch, it wasn't detrimental, whichever pulling variation. And the fact that from mid thigh you can go much heavier, or even if you do a hang pull, you can get up to sort of 120. 140% of 1RM. So we were in that time when we were publishing that, there were a lot of haters out there saying, no, you must catch. You've got to catch. Let us first of all, to be able to catch and get in that position. And there's been some weird and wonderful claims that people have made about how that could, prepare you for impacts in collision sports, etc. Well, I think that's only if you've got really poor technique and that weight's crashing down on you from above. So we also looked at some of the catch phase mechanics to actually identify, well, what loading goes through the body during the catch. Now, I'll openly admit we missed some things there. So we found that actually that catch phase, you'll have to catch the bar here in a hang power clean. From there, unless you drop it on blocks or drop it on the floor, you have to decelerate it again when you lower it back down. So actually, there could be the benefit of a higher volume of that sort of eccentric loading and deceleration phases, which we completely missed out when we did the study. Again, that was a PhD student of ours turned around and went, well, actually, you get that loading twice here, which made us think, now we probably need to go back and do all that work. One of the other interesting things that we find is if we are shortening the pull, so if you are doing it from the knee or doing it as a hang pull or a mid thigh pull rather than from the floor, it's not very fatiguing. One of my previous PhD students, Dr. David Meakin, looked at whether you need respiratory distribution for the counter movement shrug or the hang pull at loads of 140% of 1RM. And actually, the best performances were coming out on reps 4, 5, and 6. So you need a higher volume. You don't need respiratory distribution or a cluster set in that sense. And the normal sort of repetition ranges that we would recommend for power output, would be certainly 6 or less, normally much less at really high loads. But this is 140% of 1RM power clean. The only thing that you do get occasionally with the hang pulls perform at those loads is people's hamstrings are tight the next day. Well, again, that could be very, very useful. That means we can get a really good training stimulus for the hamstrings, as well as developing the sort of triple extension, force production, and power development. So I think we've answered a lot more questions, but as we've gone through that process and other people have challenged those ideas, it's given us a lot more questions. There's still a lot more things that we need to look at within that research. And the nice thing is, where I'm based near Manchester in the UK, we've got such a wealth of sports teams around us that all have good relationships with us. Most of the staff across a lot of those clubs have done their postgraduate degrees with us, so they're masters or PhDs. So they're implementing all this stuff on a daily basis and then coming back to us with more questions of what if we did this, or what if we did it that way, and how else can we refine it, which is just giving us more and more questions to keep going, which is fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, it's great to have that type of collaboration, those questions, because each one of those is another grad thesis, and just one more way to manipulate the puzzle and test it and try to understand the phenomenon more and more.
Doc, I got a question. I was in a conversation with Dr. Bill Kramer, and we were talking about some teams that utilize the force plates every day with their athletes. And what's the difference between, or how much biological variation do we see day to day versus, putting some of the training stimulus on top of that? Are we seeing just biological variation as some of the numbers we might see if we're testing every day on the force plates versus a true decrement in, say, neuromuscular performance?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because so many people do that daily force plate testing, and they also do different testing. You get occasionally, it might be something like an isometric mid-thigh pull. Most people are doing counter movement jumps because they're easy. Some are doing reactive jumps like a drop jump, or a 10-5 test. But it's really difficult because we need to know what the normal biological variation is. But that varies depending on the test we're doing, and it also varies depending on what metric we're looking at. So an isometric mid-thigh pull, it stays really stable. It hardly changes over, if you look across a couple of weeks, peak force doesn't really change. Rapid force development is far more sensitive though. And if we look at rate of force development, if you can get that reliable when you're performing those tests, that's much more sensitive. And you're normally looking at somewhere around about a 10% natural variation on a daily basis. If you look at something like a counter movement jump, it's less than 5% variation for jump height. But what you tend to find is that other metrics that give us information on the strategy, how deep they go into that squat, the time to take off, or the movement time or contraction time, depending on what force plates and software package you're using. It's those temporal aspects that change. Athletes naturally are really good at maintaining a good level of performance. So you can maintain jump height, but it took them, 200 milliseconds longer to perform the jump. That's where we start to see that there's a lot more natural variability in their performances. But it also means that with some of those metrics, they're naturally more variable. So the measurement error that we're looking for being greater than gets greater and greater and greater. So we need to establish that first. And this is really difficult. You could do it in a lab, but in an applied situation, how do you actually identify the natural biological variation of an athlete when their training stimulus on a daily basis varies, their sleep patterns vary, their dietary intake varies? Put all that together, and plus the stress of those situations, and it's pretty tough. The one thing that actually really frustrates me a lot of the time, and I see this in some of the team sports that we work with, is they'll test on a daily basis, and then I'll say to the head coach or the head of performance, so what do you do with this data? And most of the time they don't use it to inform what they're doing. What was the point in doing the daily testing? And part of it is because they're looking at it, and you're there saying, well, with a counter movement jump, I think all force plate systems will give you 100+ metrics you can look at. And they're scratching their head saying, well, which ones do I look at? And what is a meaningful change between days? Or do you watch and see, is it progressively decreasing or progressively increasing at times? And what other things do you need to factor in? So you definitely need to know what the natural variability is going to be. And then it's a case of, well, do you act? Did you plan for that change? You think if you've got a traditional 4-week block of training, so you're progressively increasing the volume over time. We're expecting later in that 4-week block, in that 3rd and 4th week for performance, they're going to be struggling a bit. You've induced some fatigue. And the problem is, I sometimes see is at that point, people intervene and go, oh no, they're fatigued. We need to back off early. No, you planned for that. Your training program is doing really well. I've never seen somebody do the reverse and go, hang on a moment, their performance hasn't declined. We've had a progressive increase in volume. My program hasn't been very good. I need to push them harder next time. I've never seen that happen. But I think in terms of the biological variation, we've got to try and make sure we understand what our natural variability is within a squad of athletes we work with, but also within the individuals, because the changes we see across a squad can mask something in an individual sometimes as well. So it's definitely very important to make sure we've got a good grasp on that. And it really is things like the rapid force production and the durations with things like jumps, which are they're more variable, but they're also more sensitive to fatigue. Do any of you guys use regular jump testing or anything on a daily basis with athletes?
We do. It highly varies across our sports. So Dr. Ivey and myself, we're at University of Louisville, and Dr. Ivey is the senior AD for athlete health and performance, and so he oversees all of our areas like sport nutrition, strength and conditioning, sports science, sports medicine, mental health, and sports psychology. And I'm the director of sports science, so I'm kind of the lead of one of those tiers, and so I can comment on that. We are guilty. We have sports who will do jump tests every single day, and I ask the same questions sometimes, like, are we actually manipulating the training programs or advising coaches, like the technical staff, on where these athletes are? So it's a question I ask. Some of our sports, they may jump an athlete maybe once or twice a week, and then some won't do it at all. So it highly varies, and that's always a challenge to like adapt to the personalities and the biases and preferences of all these different like health and performance teams that we have with each of our sports, and being able to kind of understand that and figure out how to gain more value from the things that we're doing with the athletes on a daily basis, including the data collection. But you said something that really hits home for me, and that is just this idea of like, well, if you're collecting the data every day, but you're not actually using it to manage the athletes, and like, why are we collecting the data? And I've battled with that, and I've asked that question, and a lot of times when I ask that question, it usually runs the risk of closing a door to collaboration, because they definitely want to keep collecting that data every day, even if they may not be using it. So I've had to really think about that a lot and understand like what other ways could that data provide some value to us, and so the other questions and I might start to ask is like, well, what analysis could we do at the end of the season with all of this data that might benefit us later, like turn it into a little bit of a pseudo retrospective research study, or are there unforeseen questions that could come up from which we could mine that data to answer those questions and things? And so, have you ever encountered that in those types of scenarios? Maybe you can give an example if you have one of where sometime where you were collecting this data, and maybe it wasn't until sometime substantially after the data was collected until you made a key discovery that led to more insight and maybe informed some better practice.
Yeah, we've definitely had that a couple of times with a couple of different soccer teams where they actually asked us at the university to look at their data at the end of the season, look at it, give us some feedback, almost do an audit. What can you tell us is good and bad about our practices? Have we missed anything along the way? And the key thing was that, and we did this 2 years in a row with one team, and the response or the conclusions were the same. So first time we did it was a case of, look, you need to carefully monitor the data, and you need to monitor it, because if you've got that steady decrease in performance, there's something going on. We need to then do something and interact. And we've also got to be mindful of what the data doesn't tell us. So if you think about team sports like soccer, most of the fatigue is coming from the fact that they're depleted in glycogen and they're dehydrated at the end of the game. So sometimes we see a maintenance of jump height post game, or sometimes an increase in jump height because they've lost 3 kilos. They're now lighter. It's easier to jump higher. Or, as I said, sometimes they've just maintained. So we need to factor that in. And then jump testing then isn't telling us, are they necessarily ready to get back on the pitch? It's just, is neuromuscular function getting back to normal? But if we see a continuous decline in this example, it was jump testing, testosterone levels were slowly decreasing. Sprint times that were done on a weekly basis over 5, 10, 20 meters was progressively declining in certain individuals. And then either at that point, their performance on the pitch was dropping, so that there was residual fatigue or undernutrition, whatever you might want to class as. It certainly wasn't overtraining, because they rebounded pretty quickly afterwards. Or with those declines, people got injured. Now, I'm not saying we could have predicted injury from jump testing and a few other metrics, but they could have probably better managed those players to say, right, okay, we've had 3 or 4 weeks where things are dropping off. We need a really good discussion with this athlete. What's going on? Why is this happening? Because sometimes there's really simple explanations for some of that. The interesting thing was that we recommended that they monitor it much more closely on a regular basis. The following year, they asked us to do the same. They paid the university for us to do it, and our conclusions were pretty much the same. Yeah, you need to do what we said last year and more closely monitor your data. And we've had that as one example with a rugby team in the past where an athlete's performance was slowly declining. Really, really good athlete. And we got asked to do a whole load of other battery of tests on them to see what was happening. Turns out we didn't need to do any of that because beforehand we spoke to the rugby player and said, how's everything going? Are you stressed? Is there stuff going on at home? He's like, no, everything's great. I'm end of the season. My wife and I are going away to the Caribbean. We're getting married. It's brilliant. We're currently just trying to make sure we're in great shape for any of the wedding photos. I'm like, okay, so you've changed your diet? It's like, yeah, but we've basically gone as low carb diet as possible. I'm following it with my wife to support her. So, I'm finding it a little bit more difficult. And that was it. He'd suddenly gone from consuming very high levels of carbs every day to not eating carbs so he could get really lean for his wedding and to support his wife. She didn't want carbs in the house because that was the diet she was following. But that slow decline in performance over a couple of weeks led to us asking those questions. So it is quite interesting that I think people need to watch it carefully. You don't necessarily need to react on a really frequent basis, daily or even weekly. But if you see that decline over a few weeks, we've got to start asking some of those questions then. How you do it is the problem, because then how do you offload one individual in a squad when you want them still to feel part of the team? And that gets quite tricky. And you then have to throw that back to the coach of how can we manage this? What's the best thing to do here? Or is it just, have they changed their diet so much in that with the example I've just given? If we can feed them a little bit better while they're at the training venue, when if they are doing it to support their wife, she's not going to be aware. Can we improve the situation that way? So yeah, it's definitely an interesting area because I've seen it like this for at least 10 years where you've got the regular jump testing, etc., but very little intervention then occurs. So have any of you seen similar things or found a way of intervening and being more reactive with that? And because that'd be great for me to know, and so I can feed back to some of these other teams we work with.
Yeah. Paul, I've got a question for you. Keep going in the same direction, but maybe use a different avenue to get there. And I put on my hat, the administrative hat. What I perceive is there is a growing gap between leadership and coaching. A lot of the leadership used to come from coaching. Now that leadership comes from other areas. And I perceive us to be filling that gap with more money to try to bridge the gap. So the question I have, I want to drag you in a little bit deeper into this collegiate climate and environment that we're in and ask you a question as it relates to performance, not outcomes, but performance. Can performance or strength and conditioning coaches control performance? Or do they? So can they control performance? Do they control performance? And should they control performance? Because what I perceive is we're primarily concerned with who's calling the plays, and who we're recruiting or bringing into the clubhouse, the locker room, whatever it may be, to try to control, to try to get to optimal outcomes. So I know that's a lot there. So performance, focusing on performance, not outcomes. Can strength conditioning, performance coaches control out performance? Do they? Should they?
I could go really simple here and say, no, they shouldn't. No, they can't. That's it. But no, I think you can influence performance, but that's as far as you can go because, they're only with you training for, if you're lucky, an hour, 2 hours per day. So you've got limited time with them. You can get them to do a certain amount of training. To try and enhance performance or their performance capability. You can give them recommendations to do with diet, or if you've got a dietitian or nutritionist, they can do that. You can recommend recovery strategies, etc., to try and get them into that optimal physical state. But that being said, there's 22, 23 hours of the rest of the day where you've tried to influence what they're doing. You definitely can't control it. It's up to them. And then what they do on the field of play, whatever their sport is, again, you can't control that. I actually had a really interesting discussion with one of my colleagues this morning when we were talking about how if a new coach or manager comes in, so the new head coach comes in, and suddenly you take a losing team to a winning team, we haven't changed their physical ability in that time. That could happen in a week. So what's happened there? And sometimes it's just they've given them self-belief. They've got them feeling like they're part of a team, and they've suddenly got praise instead of, because they've been on a losing streak, they've just been shouted at continually for weeks. So again, I think we can influence things, and at the same time, that influence needs to be part of a multidisciplinary team. It needs to be including the technical staff and all the coaching staff, the medical staff. And what I've seen, especially in the UK, in different sports at different levels, the teams that tend to be successful most of the time are those where everything is cohesive. They're working together as a team. Everyone knows why everyone's doing everything else. The players buy into everything because they see all of the coaching staff working and the medical staff working as a team. And that's when you get the greatest influence. Still doesn't mean you're going to win. So you definitely can't control it, but it gives you that strongest influence on the potential capability for their performance.
I love that answer. As a follow-up to that question, how do you get a young professional to understand and stay engaged if they can primarily be, I would say, influential as opposed to controlling? Because I think a lot of times younger professionals, you think I can control these factors. And if we do A, then we get B. How do you keep a younger professional engaged in the process and being part of the team if we're saying you can have influence but not control?
Yeah. Well, I think that's a $1 million question there, and we need to do better at that, because people do quit in this profession quite early because they feel like they can't control things. So, I think, for example, if it's you as a mentor or if it's me more as an educator, we need to make people aware in advance that you're not controlling everything. Even if you're the head of performance, if you're the athletic director, the coach is still going to turn around and do what they decide they want to do and what they think is best. So I think giving them examples of what happens in the real world. And we do this, one example of how we try and do this sometimes with our students is we'll say, right, okay, this is give me your plan for the week. The coach has given you 60 minutes. That's your warm up, that's getting them prepped, any mobility work, that's your session in the gym. And your session will run from, let's say, 11 till 12 in the morning, 11 a.m. till 12. There's your session. They plan it, and then you turn around and say, right, okay, the players have only just come off the pitch. They've been out there doing their technical work. It's 11:20. Now what do? You clearly can't cram everything you plan to do into 60 minutes into 40. Could you have gone out and said to the coach, your time's up? That's not going to work. Let's see you try that when you go and work in the real world, or go on a placement or an internship. So what do? How do you manipulate these things? If you've missed something that day, can you fit it in somewhere else in the rest of the week? So that might give you a bit of control back. But I think the key thing is to make sure that younger, less experienced professionals and practitioners are aware that things are changing. You've got a blueprint. You've not got a clear roadmap. Roadblocks will get put in your way, and how do you navigate around them? How do you sometimes go through those roadblocks? And how do you communicate effectively with all of those stakeholders to make sure that you have the greatest influence, and that you don't become demoralized because you feel like you can't do your job?
Well, I that is brilliant, Paul, and I mean, to me, I think the answer to that question really comes down to leadership with a P at the end and not a T at the end. But it is really hard to think that you can control or influence performance when, like, it's actually pretty hard to define performance. So I'm going to throw that one over to Dr. Pat. And like when we talk about performance, director of human performance, director of athletic performance, then you have technical coaches. Like, how do we actually define performance? Like, what is the definition of performance?
I think it's the culmination of a lot of things. It's the technical, tactical, the physical, the psychological, the physiological, the nutrition, the science, the mental aspect, the mental toughness aspect, accountability, motivation. It's all of these things, and emotional stability. It's how the mind, the brain, and the body all work together. And if it's a team sport, how these different individuals come together and carry out the game plan. It's all of the work and the trust and belief and confidence that goes into what you're doing. There's a lot that goes into performance, and sometimes you can not have your greatest performance and still come out victorious. Sometimes there's a lot of things to teach in a loss. Sometimes there's more things to teach in a loss. So I think the ability to assess and reflect are important when it comes to performance. It's not and being in the moment. How do you bring your best performance in the moment, not worrying about the past or the future, and the free throws or the missed shots or dropped passes. How do you get past those? How do you take new coaching into the real time performance? How do you interact with your coaches? How do your coaches interact with you? All of those things. Where is the team in terms of uh, you know the team building process? I think all of those things matter when it comes to performance, and I think everyone needs to define what performance is for them, having different standards, whether that's individual and whether that's team, group, or programmatic. And it's not just for athletes, it's for coaches. It should be for staff, should be for everyone involved in the program. How do you connect all of these things? How do you form comprehensive integration? And like you said, is if you have leadership with a P rather than with a T, you have a chance.
I thank you, Pat. Thank you. And I mean, like, but going back to your question on, like a young strength and conditioning professional, what you just said, I mean, you just riffed all these different factors that affect performance. And, at some point as professionals, hopefully we can have enough humility to recognize that how can you really control whatever your definition of performance may be when it is truly affected by a multitude of factors. So I might maybe use that. I know, Paul, you've done a lot of work with um, like Olympic lifts and resistance training, force production, and stuff. Have you done some other research and work in maybe some of those other factors? I know you brought up like muscle glycogen and some of those things, but have you done some research to examine how some of those factors maybe outside of strength measures or force measures may affect someone's performance, both, from a mechanical standpoint or even a metabolic standpoint?
Not a great deal. I suppose the one thing that we've touched on a little bit with a couple of PhD students in the past is the psychological aspect. And there is a huge psychological component. We actually had one of one of my previous colleagues, when he was a student, they looked at misinforming people about the load that was on the bar to see whether they could perform better or whether you could impair performance. And they did a really interesting study just for deadlifts. They did a 3RM deadlift with people. So they did their 3RM, came back the following week, a few days later, and misinformed people of the load. So the load was covered up. They couldn't see what the load was. They told them it was heavier when it was slightly lighter. And they couldn't move the bar off the floor. So they told them it was 30% heavier than what they'd done as a 3RM, but it was actually lighter. And then in other cases, they told them it was lighter, it was 10% heavier, and they still managed 3 reps, which you shouldn't be able to do. You'd be struggling to get 1 repetition out of them. So that misinformation seems to work really well. We also had a PhD student that tried doing similar with power clean variations in misinforming them. That doesn't work. Your technique falls apart. You can really feel that bar's not accelerating. Whereas something like a deadlift or a squat, you can grind it out. But that really highlights that there's a huge psychological component to how well people perform. And if you suddenly make them second guess themselves and think, oh, can I do this? Well, there's something that they can definitely lift. They can pick that weight up because it's 20% lighter than their 3RM. Suddenly they can't move it off the floor. So that part is definitely key. And I think that's going back to the bit about how a coach can be so influential. If the coach can make people believe in themselves and believe that they can perform well or that they can win, that is unbelievably influential on all different aspects of their performance. And that's something that I think we need. Anyone who's working in performance or in strength and conditioning and sports science, we probably all need a better understanding of that. And the really good technical coaches are those that seem to know how to do that and reinforce without directly giving people praise, but they make them feel better about themselves. And suddenly the performance levels start increasing, whether it's in the gym, whether it's on the pitch. Other people will make them feel under pressure, and you notice things start to deteriorate at that point. So I think that the psychological aspect is definitely something that's really, really interesting to look at. But I've not done enough research in that area to really, really tell you a lot about it.
Now, Paul, and we're in the part of the college football season here in the States where you have teams that did not have successful seasons. They're going to go into the 2026 year with heightened enthusiasm and outlook. So a lot of them, when they come back, they're all right. We're going to do a full battery of assessments. The day they start the testing or to give these coaches some guidelines, what would be the order that you would suggest that they, do some of these assessments, whether it's, strength or power assessments or, agility, and how many days in between would be optimal if they try to cram all these in 1 day versus 2 over 3? What would your advice be to these coaches?
So I suppose the key thing is make sure you're doing the least fatiguing tests first, so that's not having a negative impact on the subsequent test. Make sure there's sufficient time in between those tests, so that if you do induce some type of fatigue, that kind of dissipated so it doesn't influence the test. The key thing is, though, that if you're going to repeat this at multiple time points, standardize it. So if you've got 5 minutes between a counter movement jump test in some form of reactive jump and then another 5-minute rest before an isometric squat or mid-thigh pull, standardize it with that same amount of time. Because if there is still some residual fatigue, it's the same every time you do it. Whereas if one time there's 5 minutes, the next time there's 15, well, if one of those gets better, was that because they just have recovered more from the previous test? Now, the reality is those tests I've just mentioned, they're not fatiguing anyway. You should be fine with that. If you're fatiguing with those types of tests, within a single session, even if you're doing 4 or 5 trials of each one, that tells us a lot more than the test itself. So I personally would go with doing those types of tests, having things like your jump testing, a ballistic task like a counter movement jump, a reactive or more plyometric task, maximal isometric strength test in there. you're definitely going to have your sort of 1 RMs or 3 RMs in there as well on key lifts, because we can't predict what loads you should be lifting from something like an isometric test. So we have to have those dynamic tests. But again, if you look at those, with some of the dynamic tests, if you do a 1 RM power clean, give somebody a 15-minute rest, they can go on and do a 1 RM back squat afterwards. Or you could throw in a bench press in between and then a back squat so the lower body's had a longer time period to recover. But then what I'd probably do is do any of your more aerobic or muscular endurance type tests on a separate day. Now, in terms of how far in between those days would you do it? Would it be 24, 48, 72 hours? You need to know the training status of those individuals when they first come back to do that. Have they done anything in the prior 4 weeks beforehand? Because if I look at this in different sports in the UK, if we're looking at rugby league or rugby union, most of those athletes will train in the off season. They'll work hard. They want to maintain muscle mass. They're proud about their strength and their size, their speed, their power. Soccer players, well, don't train much in season. And as soon as they go off season, they train even less. So doing any of that sort of testing, if it was a group of soccer players in the UK, they're going to be sore for a few days. So we're going to have a long rest period. So, you'd need a good idea of, well, what type of training have they been doing? Because if that suddenly becomes a novel stimulus for them, you've got severe DOMS for 48 to 72 hours. But if it's something they're familiar with a strength and power type activity, you can probably go 48 hours later and then maybe do some sprint, some change of direction, and some aerobic capacity type testing.
But I mean, you do know that every veteran strength conditioning coach realizes that if you test the athletes when they're fatigued and sore with DOMS, that the post-training follow-up tests are going to look a lot better.
Yeah.
Just putting that out there.
Yeah, and well, we even see that with athletes where they won't put in on max effort at the beginning of pre-season because they know they're going to get pushed really hard pre-season, and they want to look like they've actually improved dramatically in that time. So it's that's where it's always difficult, because people say, how do you know that they're putting in a maximum effort? And that in itself is difficult, because if you think about force plate testing, you can put up a leaderboard, you can get instant scores, but it depends on what test you're performing. If you're doing a counter movement jump and you put up the jump height results, everyone starts changing their strategy. They do a much deeper squat, time to take off increases, so they can maximize jump height. But that's not their normal jump strategy. So is that the best approach to use? If you put time to take off, jump height comes down because everyone chases a shorter time to take off. If you're doing something like an isometric squat or isometric mid-thigh pull, you're fine. If you put a leaderboard up with a 1 RM, well, you can't really cheat the 1 RM, can you? You're just going to get stuck under the bar. So there's certain things where you can use leaderboards and stuff to try and improve the performance, get them more motivated. And again, you need to know your squad. I would imagine, as you said, like with the college football players, most of those, like we get with rugby players in the UK, they're probably proud of their size, strength, power, etc. So they're going to want to perform well. They don't want anyone to outperform them. That's not going to be the same across all sports.
How would some of your assessments differ when training a military population?
Actually, the stuff that we're doing currently with the military, the tests that we're doing are very similar. So we still do a counter movement jump test. We still do an isometric mid-thigh pull. We do a rebound task, because part of the things that we need is, if they get injured, what do we need to do to return them back to duty? And what do you do in those stages of rehab to get them ready to return to run, for example? Have they got the reactive capability from a more plyometric task like a drop jump? So we'll still do those. There are certain tasks in the military that they do as standard anyway. There's normally a 2-mile run. In some regiments, there's a 2-mile run with a pack on the back, carrying weight, etc. I think all regiments now do a hex bar deadlift at different incremental loads, and it's how many repetitions can you do. And then they have their very much specific tests, as in, you've got to put a jerry can on the back of a flatbed truck at a certain height. So that's not scaled based on, there's no point working out the equivalent of your isometric mid-thigh pull peak force relative to body mass. Everyone has to lift that jerry can to the same height, irrespective of your height, your sex, etc. So there's a whole range of different tests like that they have to do. But the ones that we do most of the time are still those standard tests because it gives us a good idea of their ballistic, their reactive capability, their maximum force production, their rapid force production. And then you can use that to inform, as I said, rehab if they get injured and return to duty. But you can also use that to inform them about what aspects of training they need to focus on. Because as with most of us, if you've got a certain strength, that's what you like training. If there's a certain part of that you get assessed on which isn't very good, that's probably the part you don't train very frequently because you don't enjoy doing it. And you might not enjoy doing it because you're not very good at it. So we end up with a similar battery of tests. We have started to expand some of that because there's so many lower limb injuries, ankle injuries, and knee injuries. So we've started to do some isometric plantar flexion testing on the force plates. Everyone likes to do a calf capacity test where they just do as many reps as you can of a calf raise. It's too variable. It's not going to tell you anything. And if you do that in the military, we probably need that with whatever they normally carry in a pack on their back as well. So we do isometric plantar flexion. We do the same for hamstrings. We've started doing this sort of knee extension test as well. So depending on what injury they might get, we've got very specific data on how we need to rehabilitate individual muscle groups as well. But overall, it's not dramatically different to what we do with athletes because they are, you look at what some of those individuals have to perform depending on the regiment they're in, and they're athletes. There are some we've tested where you'd say they're not athletes, but they're not in the better regiments.
You mentioned a little bit about some of the strength measures with like in case someone gets hurt. I really like the approach of identifying, okay, we have a high rate of in this particular injury. So then it would be a good idea to get some trained baseline measures on these things because we know that we're going to have a lot of them. I think that's a really novel approach. Like here at Louisville, we do have an applied epidemiologist with a background in rehab and strength conditioning, and he's a statistician, but I think that is a novel approach where the injury trends can guide some of your baseline testing that you might do to guide rehab. On that note, that's another reason. There's another reason that I've been able to use retrospective data in injury cases, where even though we may not be using that data on a daily basis, but one thing that's come up here is re-injuries is a particular interest to us. And when an athlete gets hurt, especially if it's a re-injury, a lot of times you'll get, not every time, but a lot of times you'll get a coach who starts pointing fingers, asking how the heck did this athlete get hurt again? And so we've done deep dives where we've done individual athlete case studies. Here's this athlete, we know they have a re-injury, significant time loss re-injury, and we go back and just look at every data byte we have on them to just see what did we miss something? What could we have caught maybe that to prevent this re-injury, or what could we have done better? And that's really the nature of it. But it's been really fascinating because we've identified some really interesting things. Like to give just one concrete example, then I have a question for you. But we actually identified that one athlete had an eating disorder, but a lot of people in the health and performance team weren't aware. There are some people who are aware, but a lot weren't. And what we observed, female athlete, over the course of about a year, they had lost a significant amount of weight. In a power sport athlete, if you see them lose some weight, hopefully that corresponds with an increase in those propulsive measures like a sprint performance or a jump measure, as you don't have to move as much weight. But we didn't see that, and maintenance at best. And then we also saw, relative power didn't improve either. We saw their like conditioning, like a yo-yo, those results dramatically drop. So there's definitely a weight loss, maybe a metabolic thing because they're not performing the conditioning. And then so we asked and we said, hey, like we think this athlete, like, do they have a history of eating disorder? Sure enough. But what we identified was there was a lack of communication because if the strength conditioning coach isn't aware of that or different people who are working with and training that athlete on a regular basis, we weren't aware and so we identified that that was something we could improve is just, you know, making sure everyone's aware of what's going on with our athletes. But back to like some of those force measures, I believe that you are starting to do some work with force measures and informing rehab. So, what's late and great for you in that area?
So the things we're looking at the moment, as I've sort of mentioned, we're looking at what are the baseline levels, what are their normal levels of performance in some of those tasks, and so if it's an isometric strength test, what's their maximum force production relative to their mass, but also what's their rapid force production. So how much force can they produce over 150, 200, 250 milliseconds. And that rapid force production is really important because there's a few studies, especially on anterior cruciate ligament injuries and the rehabilitation of them, that shows that you can get people's strength back relatively quickly. But most people are being returned to sport when there's still a huge deficit in that rate of force development. So that's the bit we probably need to enhance. So what our plan is to get all of this normative data and all the benchmark data, and then look at during the rehabilitation process, getting at the military personnel back up to those minimum standards, and then monitor them. The problem is, and we've got to do a follow-up with this, because when they're having intensive rehab, that's great. They're going to improve dramatically because it's intensive rehab. They're not deployable. Once they are redeployed, what happens? Do they stop doing all of the stuff they were doing, and then effectively they start to detrain? And is that causing the re-injuries? Because there's a detraining aspect of it. With some of them, they might actually continue to improve. So then we can observe over time to try and identify what is it that is creating those re-injuries. When it is, like a non-contact injury, and something that could be where there are modifiable risk factors. So that's one aspect that we're looking at, along with then still looking at things like the counter movement jump test, a reactive jump test, because there's a lot of different tasks that they have to do, which involves that ballistic or more plyometric type activity. But again, it's trying to make sure we've got that whole, the whole continuum covered. Because you can say, well, their isometric strength is great. Well, brilliant. What if the person's struggling running? And that's more their reactive or ballistic capability that they're needing to improve. So it's really a case of trying to identify what happens over time during rehab, and also during the rehab process, can we inform what they're doing? So they might have planned, we're going to have a block where we're trying to increase muscle mass or we're trying to increase strength. But if strength goes up dramatically and rate of force development hardly moves, we know in the next block we've really got to emphasize that rate of force development. So we might then be able to individualize the training more. The nice thing is, this is unfortunate, but it's nice from a research point of view. We know that we're going to get access to a few thousand people each year that have consistent injuries, just because of the number of people in the military and the records of the injuries that come through. So that's going to be great, because we should be able to get some really conclusive evidence from that, which if we tried to do that in soccer in the UK, we'd have to get every single soccer team involved. That's not going to happen. Whereas with this, it's much easier to have those large samples, because we know that they get huge cohorts of individuals with injuries and with re-injuries. So it's really going to be interesting to see where the data takes us for this. But it's in its early stages. We've got a lot of the benchmark data already collected across multiple different regiments. And now it's really a case of us starting over the next couple of months to work with more of those injured populations and use that data to inform their return to duty, but also the rehabilitation.
Outstanding. I think it's really cool how you've been able to take some of the work you've done on athletes and start to translate to some other populations like soldiers and things. So that's really impressive. Thanks for sharing that.
No problem.
Hey, Paul, we always like to have our guests share, some suggestions for reading materials for our audience. But before your recommendations, tell the audience about the textbook. I think all of them should have that. You helped co-author on, advanced techniques. Where they can find that book and so forth.
Okay, so the advanced strength and conditioning, an evidence-based approach with Anthony Turner. You can get it off Amazon. You can get it direct from Routledge, the publishers. It's a second edition they're on now. And it really covers a whole range of different aspects of strength and conditioning practices. While it's advanced strength and conditioning, it's not really advanced. They're basic principles that can be applied really efficiently and effectively. Fine, you've got things like cluster sets in there. You've got eccentric training in there. Those don't always have to be used as advanced techniques. Those things like cluster sets can be used really effectively with beginners as well to give them feedback within a set. But yeah, you can find that on directly from the publishers or on Amazon. And hopefully anyone that reads it will learn as much as I did from editing the book, because that was a really interesting process. You can't understand, or be up to date with all of those different topics. So it's great to have a really good range of contributors on there who've got lots of applied experience, but also lots and lots of research experience as well.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Paul. We're going to go ahead and wrap this show up. Where can our listeners and our viewers find you?
Twitter or Instagram, not Twitter anymore, is it X or Instagram, at Paul Comfort 1975, which gives away my age. That's probably the best place. If you want to look at the research, find me on ResearchGate, and anything that I can put on there freely available, I will. Anything that's breaching copyright isn't going on there because I don't want to get in trouble. But that's probably the best places to find me.
Well, congratulations on being on this planet for half a century. And this has been really good. I know we can do a part 2 with this. And if you would be up to it, we would definitely love to circle back around with you. Until then, we appreciate you. Thank you for being on the show.
Brilliant. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks a lot, Paul.
Great job.
Dr. Ted, Dr. Ivey.